Jake Lewis stood on the bridge of the ship and watched the stars pass by through the window. He was the commander of humanity's first real deep space vessel, and today they were chasing a signal that came from nowhere. The year was 2347, and humans had only just figured out how to travel faster than light. They called it quantum fold technology, and it was still new enough that Jake felt his stomach turn every time they used it. The signal had been weak at first, but as they got closer, it grew stronger. Emma Price sat at the sensor station, and her eyes went wide as she read the numbers. She turned to Jake and told him that whatever was out there was massive. It was the size of Earth's moon, and it was just floating in empty space between star systems. Danny Morrison checked the readings twice and confirmed that the structure was over 2 million years old. Jake called together a small team to go aboard the station. He picked Emma because she was good with technology, and Danny because he could fix anything. He also brought Lisa Grant, who handled security, and Kevin Hayes, who studied alien life, even though they had never found any until now. They put on their suits and crossed from their ship to the ancient station through a connecting tunnel that Danny set up. The airlock opened, and lights began to flicker on inside the station. They were dim at first, but grew brighter as the team walked forward. The corridors were huge and made of some kind of crystal material that seemed to glow from within. Jake had never seen anything like it. The walls were smooth and covered in symbols that shifted and changed as they watched. A voice spoke to them in perfect English, and it came from everywhere at once. The station's computer system had detected them and somehow learned their language in seconds. It welcomed them as Species 7294 and told them they were now registered as the dominant species from Earth. By ancient law, this meant humanity was now a member of something called the Galactic Council. Kevin Hayes moved to a nearby terminal and started reading the data that scrolled across its surface. His hands shook as he translated the information. This station was the headquarters of a government that had once united thousands of alien civilizations across the entire galaxy. But the log showed that the council had been abandoned over 50,000 years ago, and no one had returned until now. They walked deeper into the station and found a massive central chamber. It was so large that Jake could not see the far wall even with his helmet lights on full. In the center of the room, a holographic display activated and began showing them images. The history of the Galactic Council played out before their eyes like a movie. The story was not a happy one. The Council had started well enough with different species working together to solve problems and share knowledge, but over time things changed. The member species became obsessed with rules and procedures. They created committees to oversee committees. They wrote regulations about how to write regulations. Innovation died because anything new required approval from 17 different departments, and that could take decades. Then a threat appeared. The hologram showed a dark cloud spreading through space and consuming entire star systems. It was made of dark matter, and it ate everything it touched. Planets, stars, ships, all gone. The council members knew about it, but they could not agree on what to do. Some wanted to fight it. Others wanted to study it first. Still others wanted to form a committee to discuss whether they should form a committee to study whether they should fight it. While they debated and argued and filed paperwork, worlds burned. Billions died. The civilizations that could escape did so. They abandoned the council in disgust and retreated to their own corners of the galaxy. The station was left empty as a reminder of their failure. The hologram ended and the chamber fell silent. Jake stood there for a long moment thinking about what they had just learned. Emma asked him what they should do now. Should they report back to Earth and let the politicians decide? Should they leave the station where it was and forget about it? Jake shook his head. He told his team that they were going to bring this station back to life. If humanity was now officially a member of this council, then they were going to do something with it. They were not going to let it sit dark and empty for another 50,000 years. Danny said it would take months to get the power systems working again. Emma said it would take even longer to understand all the station's systems. Lisa pointed out that they only had one ship and 5 people. How were they supposed to run a station the size of a moon? Jake smiled at them and said they would figure it out as they went. That was the human way. They did not wait for perfect plans or ideal conditions. They jumped in and solved problems as they came up. The old council had died because they forgot how to do that. Humanity would not make the same mistake. Kevin found files that showed where other species had gone after the council fell. Most of the information was outdated, but it was a start. Jake told Emma to get the communication systems working. If they were going to rebuild the council, they would need to contact other civilizations and convince them to give it another chance. Over the next 3 months, the team worked without stopping. They brought more people from Earth, engineers, scientists, artists, and thinkers of all kinds. Jake did not want politicians or bureaucrats. He wanted people who could build things and solve problems. He wanted people who were not afraid to try new ideas. Slowly, the station came back to life. Lights turned on in sections that had been dark for millennia. The computer systems booted up and began processing data again. The quantum communication network activated and sent signals out into the galaxy. Most went unanswered, but a few species responded with messages of their own. The first real contact came from beings called the Krell. They existed in multiple dimensions at once and spoke through a translation device. Their ambassador asked why anyone would bother turning the council back on. The council was dead, and it had died for good reasons. Jake sent back a simple message. They were not bringing back the old council. They were building something new, something that actually worked, something that did things instead of just talking about doing things. He broadcast his message on all channels so anyone listening could hear it. Within weeks, more species began to respond. Some were curious, some were skeptical, some were desperate because they had problems and no one else to turn to. Jake welcomed them all and told them to come to the station if they wanted to talk. No formal negotiations, no complex procedures. Just show up and they would figure things out together. The galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. The council station blazed with light for the first time in thousands of years, and Jake Lewis stood in the main control room watching ships arrive from across the galaxy. 3 months had passed since they first found the station, and now 300 humans lived and worked here. Jake had been careful about who he brought. He did not want people who loved rules and regulations. He wanted builders and dreamers and people who thought problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved. Beth Hughes worked at the communication station, and she was good at her job. She had managed to activate the ancient quantum network that connected thousands of worlds. Signals went out across space faster than light, and slowly answers came back. Most worlds stayed silent, but some remembered the old council and wanted to know what was happening. The Krell were the first to send a real representative. Their ambassador appeared as a floating crystal that shifted through colors humans had no names for. The translation matrix made their words understandable, but the meaning was clear enough without it. The Krell thought the council was a waste of time. It had failed once and would fail again. Jake met with the ambassador in one of the station's large chambers. He did not dress formally or prepare speeches. He just talked like he would talk to anyone. He told the Krell that the old council had died because it forgot how to move fast and take action. This new version would be different. No committees that took years to decide simple things. No regulations that needed 17 signatures. Just people working together to solve real problems. The Krell ambassador seemed doubtful but agreed to stay and observe. Within days, more species arrived. The Vryn came next. They were amphibious beings who controlled much of the galaxy's trade networks. Their ships were massive and elegant, and they brought samples of goods from 100 different worlds. Then came the Theks, who existed as a hive mind, spread across millions of individual bodies. After them came the Zorathi, who were warriors and had been fighting the dark matter anomaly alone for centuries. Each species that arrived expected formal negotiations and diplomatic protocols. They brought lawyers and trade experts and thick documents outlining their positions. Jake confused them all by inviting everyone to simply sit down and talk. No formal meetings, no scheduled negotiations, just conversations. Danny Morrison turned one of the station's huge halls into a workshop. Species could bring their technology and share it freely. At first, the alien visitors were suspicious. Why would anyone share their secrets without demanding something in return? But Danny just shrugged and said that knowledge was only useful if people could use it. Hoarding it helped no one. Emma Price started what she called jam sessions. She would gather representatives from different species and give them a problem to solve together. It did not matter if the problem was big or small. The point was to get them working as a team. The first few sessions were awkward because no one knew how to work without formal structures. But gradually they figured it out. Kolos was the Vryn trade ambassador, and he was particularly confused by the whole operation. He kept asking where the lawyers were and who was in charge of regulatory compliance. Jake told him they would worry about that stuff later. Right now, they had bigger problems to solve. The dark matter anomaly was still out there eating star systems, and the galaxy needed to do something about it. Dr. Lisa Warren led the station's science division, and she was brilliant. She gathered scientists from every species that would participate and set them to work on the anomaly problem. The Krell understood dimensional mathematics better than anyone. The Thex could process data faster than any computer humans had ever built. The Zerathi had been studying the anomaly for centuries and knew its patterns. Lisa combined human quantum fold theory with Krell dimensional math and Thex computing power. After 6 weeks of nonstop work, her team created something new. It was a shield that could deflect the dark matter instead of just blocking it. The implications were enormous. They could protect whole star systems if they deployed enough shields. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The anomaly was expanding in multiple directions, and they would need to deploy shields across dozens of systems at the same time. It would require ships and resources and coordination on a scale that seemed impossible. They would need hundreds of vessels working together perfectly. The old council would have spent years planning such an operation. They would have formed committees and subcommittees. They would have written procedures and contingency plans. They would have held meetings about holding meetings. Jake gave them 2 weeks to make it happen. The alien representatives thought he was insane. 2 weeks was not enough time to plan anything that complex. But Jake just smiled and said planning was overrated. They had the technology and they had willing participants. They would figure out the details as they went. Ryan Bell was Jake's second in command, and he helped coordinate the effort. Ships began arriving from 17 different species. None of them had worked together before. Their communication systems were barely compatible. Their ships ran on different power sources and used different navigation systems. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it worked. Captains talked to each other directly without going through official channels. Engineers shared solutions in real time as problems came up. When one species' shields failed in testing, another species figured out a fix in hours instead of weeks. The operation came together like a living organism adapting to its environment. But not everyone was happy about it. The hierarchy was an old species that had built an empire over 10,000 years. They had rules for everything and procedures that dated back millennia. They valued order above all else. When they heard what Jake was doing, they sent their High Arbiter to shut it down. The High Arbiter was a being of pure energy contained in an ornate vessel. It materialized in the council chamber with a flash of light and immediately began listing violations. Jake had ignored proper diplomatic channels. He had failed to file the correct paperwork. He had acted without consensus from established authorities. The list went on and on. Jake listened patiently until the Arbiter finished. Then he asked a simple question. How many colony worlds had the hierarchy lost to the anomaly while they were filing all that paperwork? The Arbiter stuttered and said 3 worlds, but that was beside the point. Jake said it was exactly the point. 3 worlds full of people died while the hierarchy followed proper procedure. Emma activated a display showing the fleet they had assembled. Ships from 17 species all ready to deploy shield technology. They could save dozens of worlds in the next month. The old council would still be forming committees to discuss whether to form committees. The High Arbiter threatened sanctions and embargoes. Other old species joined in threatening punishment for this breach of protocol. Jake's response was to make everything public. Every meeting, every decision, every debate was broadcast across the quantum network for anyone to watch. Transparency cut through political games better than any argument could. The younger civilizations loved it. Species that had only recently developed space travel flocked to the station. They brought energy and ideas and a willingness to try new things. The Kelvor were flying mammals that the old council had rejected as too chaotic. They became some of humanity's closest allies. Their representative Thress said it was about time someone understood that you had to fly through storms instead of waiting for them to pass. Then the dark matter anomaly changed course. It turned directly toward the hierarchy's core worlds. The same species that had opposed everything Jake did now faced extinction. Under the old system, diplomats would have held emergency sessions and debated aid packages for months. Jake mobilized the fleet in 6 hours. Pete Gardner commanded the shield deployment. He coordinated ships from 20 different species that had never worked together before. It was messy and chaotic and improvised. It also worked perfectly. The hierarchy's worlds were saved. The High Arbiter approached Jake afterward. It said it did not understand human methods but could not argue with the results. Jake told the Arbiter that was the whole point. They were not trying to build a perfect system. They were trying to build one that actually saved lives. 6 months after finding the ancient station, Jake Lewis sat in what used to be a formal council chamber and helped turn it into something completely different. The room had once held elaborate thrones for ambassadors and had rules about who could sit where and who could speak when. Now it had comfortable chairs arranged in circles and anyone could sit anywhere. Ryan Bell sat across from him and they were writing what they called the punk protocols on a datapad. The rules were simple enough that they fit on one page. If you could do something in a day, then do not take a week. Try things and fix them as you go instead of planning forever. If the rules get in the way, then change the rules. Ryan looked at what they had written and laughed. He said the old council would have needed 6 months just to approve the font size. Jake said that was exactly why the old council was dead. Word of the new protocols spread fast and the reaction was immediate. The established powers were horrified. They had spent thousands of years building systems based on order and procedure. The idea that anyone could just ignore those systems and make up new rules seemed insane to them. A coalition formed to oppose what they called the Chaos Station. The Methodical Assembly was particularly upset. They were a species that had turned bureaucracy into an art form. Their civilization ran on rules and regulations that covered every possible situation. They had protocols for protocols. Their representative arrived at the station with a delegation of 50 legal experts and a document listing over 10,000 violations of established galactic law. Jake met with them in the main hall. He did not bring lawyers or legal experts. He brought Emma Price and Danny Morrison and a few engineers who were working on a water recycling project. The Methodical Assembly representative, whose name was impossible for humans to pronounce, demanded to know why Jake was not taking this seriously. Jake said he was taking it very seriously, but he had other things to do besides argue about paperwork. The representative presented the document of violations and demanded that Jake address each one. Jake glanced at it and asked how long it would take to go through all 10,000 points. The representative said it would require at least 3 months of hearings. Jake said he did not have 3 months because there were actual problems to solve. He offered to answer any 3 questions the representative thought were most important. Everything else could be sent in writing and he would read it if he had time. The Methodical Assembly was not used to being dismissed like that. They threatened to bring sanctions before the galactic community. Jake said that was fine, but it would not change anything. The council station would keep operating exactly as it had been. They were saving worlds and solving problems. If the old powers wanted to waste time on sanctions, that was their choice. Other species joined the opposition. The Vryn Trade Guild saw the new council as a threat to their monopolies. The hierarchy had grudgingly accepted help but still distrusted the chaotic methods. The Convergence was a species that valued consensus above all else, and the human approach seemed dangerously individualistic. Together they formed what they called the Confederation of Established Powers. Their strategy was to isolate the council station diplomatically. They would refuse to trade with species that cooperated with humanity. They would block council ships from entering their space. They would use their economic and political power to force everyone back into the old system. It should have worked. The old powers controlled most of the galaxy's resources and trade routes, but Jake had made everything transparent. Every meeting was broadcast publicly. Every decision was explained in real time. Anyone could watch and see exactly what the council was doing and why. When the Confederation started their isolation campaign, people across the galaxy could see it happening. They could see the old powers trying to protect their positions instead of solving problems. The younger civilizations rallied behind humanity. Species that had only recently joined galactic civilizations saw what was happening and chose sides. They did not have the resources of the old powers, but they had numbers and energy. Hundreds of species declared support for the new council. Trade routes shifted almost overnight as younger species started dealing directly with each other and cutting out the old monopolies. Kate Sullivan was the station's chief medical officer, and she studied history in her spare time. She started analyzing the patterns of galactic civilizations and found something interesting. Every major species followed the same path. They started dynamic and innovative. They achieved great things. Then gradually they built more and more rules to protect what they had. The rules became more important than the reasons for making them. Innovation died and the civilization stagnated. She called it cultural entropy and presented her findings to Jake. Societies mistake complexity for sophistication. They think having a 1,000-page protocol for everything makes them advanced when really it just makes them slow and fragile. The old council had died of complexity. The new one stayed alive by staying simple, but staying simple was harder than it looked. As more species joined the council, there was pressure to formalize things. Different species needed different things and someone had to coordinate it all. The easy solution would have been to create departments and assign roles and write procedures. That was what every civilization did. Jake resisted it as long as he could. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Kelvor representative named Thress suggested that maybe humans were thinking about organization wrong. Every species tried to build rigid structures because they were afraid of chaos. But what if they built flexible structures instead? What if they created teams that formed and dissolved as needed instead of permanent departments? Emma Price took the idea and ran with it. She created what she called fluid teams. People grouped together to solve specific problems and then disbanded when the problem was solved. Someone might work on shield technology one week and food distribution the next. There were no permanent assignments. No one owned a position. You worked on whatever needed working on. The old powers said it would never work. How could anything get done without clear lines of authority? Who was responsible if something went wrong? How did you track productivity? Jake's answer was simple. Things got done because people wanted to get them done. Everyone was responsible. Productivity was measured by results, not reports. 3 months into the new system, the council station was operating more efficiently than ever. Problems got solved faster because the right people came together naturally, instead of waiting for permission to work together. Innovation increased because ideas could be tried immediately, instead of going through approval processes. The real test came during what became known as the Sector 7 crisis. 2 species called the Denori and the Kelvin had mining operations in the same region. A dispute over mineral rights escalated into armed conflict. Dozens of ships faced off ready to fight. Under the old council, diplomats would have spent weeks arranging preliminary talks. Greg Patterson was a human who specialized in conflict resolution. He heard about the situation and took a ship out to the disputed sector. He did not ask permission or file a mission plan. He just went. When he arrived, he contacted both sides and told them to send representatives to his ship. Both sides were suspicious, but they came. Greg did something strange. He locked the representatives in a cargo bay with basic fabrication equipment and told them they could not leave until they built something together. Both sides were furious. This was not diplomacy. This was not negotiation. Greg said he did not care what they called it. They could either waste time, arguing, or do something productive. 18. Hours later, the representatives emerged with a design for a joint mining platform that could extract minerals more efficiently than either species could alone. They had also become something like friends. Sometimes the best way to solve arguments was to give people something better to do than argue. Stories like that spread across the galaxy. The punk philosophy was not just about breaking rules. It was about finding better ways to do things. It was about trusting people to solve problems instead of controlling them with procedures. It was about action over discussion. The Confederation of Established Powers held a summit to discuss the growing problem. Vex was their leader and spoke for the methodical assembly. He laid out the threat clearly. If the human approach continued spreading, it would destroy everything the old civilizations had built. Society required structure and hierarchy and proper procedure. What humans called freedom was just another word for anarchy. But even within the Confederation, cracks were showing. Younger members of old species looked at what the Council was accomplishing and asked why their own governments could not do the same. Protests erupted on multiple worlds. People wanted their leaders to act more like humans and less like bureaucrats. The galaxy was changing and no amount of sanctions or threats could stop it. The punk revolution had begun, and it was spreading faster than anyone had expected. 1 year after Jake Lewis found the ancient station, the galaxy was transforming in ways that went far beyond politics and government. The punk philosophy had escaped the council chambers and spread into the culture of hundreds of civilizations. Young beings across space were questioning everything their societies had taught them about how things should work. Sophie Martinez ran what she called the fusion zone on the station. She was an artist from Earth, and she had turned an entire section into a space where different species could create together. The results were extraordinary. Krell made sculptures that existed in multiple dimensions at once, and human painters added colors that shifted based on the viewer's emotional state. Thek's computational music merged with Vryn water songs to create sounds no single species could have imagined. But the real revolution was happening far from the Council station. On worlds throughout the galaxy, young people were starting their own movements inspired by what they saw humans doing. The changes started small but grew quickly. A group of young Vryn traders calling themselves the Free Merchants began operating outside the traditional guild system. They offered flexible deals and rapid responses instead of following the elaborate protocols their elders demanded. The Vryn guilds tried to shut them down. They brought legal challenges and economic pressure. They invoked ancient guild laws that dated back thousands of years. But the Free Merchants were too fast and too adaptable. They operated like humans did. When the guilds blocked one approach, they simply tried another. Within 6 months, the Free Merchants controlled 20% of Vryn trade, and the old guilds were scrambling to keep. Something even more dramatic happened among the Theks. For millions of years, they had existed as a perfect hive mind. Individual Theks bodies had no independent thoughts. Everything was consensus. Everything was shared. Then some young Theks who had been working with humans started expressing individual preferences. They made decisions without consulting the hive. They disagreed with each other. The elder queens who guided the Theks' consciousness were disturbed. They saw it as a disease spreading through their species. They tried to suppress the individualism, but it kept growing. The young Theks called it finding their voice. They said the hive mind was beautiful but limiting. They wanted to experience both connection and independence. Even the rigid hierarchy saw protests. Junior arbiters began submitting proposals to streamline procedures that had not changed in 1,000 years. When the High Command rejected the proposals, the junior members took their arguments public. They broadcast their frustrations across the quantum network, where everyone could see. Citizens of hierarchy worlds began demanding change. Henry Cole commanded Earth's expanded fleet, and he reported something surprising. Applications were flooding in from beings of other species who wanted to join human crews. They said they wanted to learn the human way of doing things. Some of them were young and looking for adventure. Others were older and tired of the systems they had lived in their whole lives. All of them wanted something different. The Council station itself continued to evolve. Carlos White was an engineer who loved solving impossible problems. He had redesigned entire sections of the station based on input from dozens of species. The result was architecture that should not work according to any single species' principles, but somehow functioned better than anything designed by traditional methods. Corridors curved in ways that accommodated both flying and walking species. Gravity varied by section to match different preferences. The environmental systems managed dozens of different atmospheric compositions simultaneously. Alan Pierce worked as the station's historian, and he documented what he called the Great Unlearning. Species across the galaxy were actively dismantling their most complex systems. They were throwing out regulations that no one could remember the reason for. They were simplifying procedures that had grown baroque over centuries. It was like watching evolution in fast forward as civilizations adapted to a new environment. But not everyone celebrated these changes. The Confederation of Established Powers met in secret on a neutral world far from the Council station. Supreme Coordinator Vex led the discussion, and the mood was dark. If these changes continued, everything they had built would collapse. Society required structure and hierarchy and proper procedure. What humans called freedom was really just chaos waiting to explode. They decided to force a confrontation at the upcoming Grand Assembly. This was a gathering Jake had called to address the next phase of dealing with the dark matter anomaly. Representatives from over 200 species would attend. Vex planned to use that platform to challenge humanity's leadership directly and demand a return to proper governance. The day of the Grand Assembly arrived, and the main chamber was packed with beings from across the galaxy. Some floated. Some stood. Some existed in formats that humans still did not fully understand. Jake had prepared no formal speech. He planned to just talk about the anomaly situation and discuss solutions. He did not expect what happened next. Vex materialized in the center of the chamber with perfect dramatic timing. The methodical assembly leader commanded attention through sheer presence. Vex began speaking, and the translation systems carried the words to every being present. Humanity had violated every principle of galactic governance. They had operated without authorization. They had ignored established precedent. They had encouraged disorder throughout civilized space. The Confederation demanded that humanity be removed from Council leadership, and the station returned to proper management. The chamber erupted. Species took sides immediately. The older civilizations stood with Vex. The younger ones defended humanity. Arguments broke out across the room in a dozen languages. The noise was deafening. Jake let it continue for exactly 5 minutes while he stood quietly at his position. Then he stepped forward and the room gradually fell silent. Jake spoke simply and directly. He said that humanity had indeed violated principles. They had violated the principle that said following rules was more important than solving problems. They had violated the idea that complexity equals competence. They had violated the notion that you need permission to help people who are dying. He activated the main display and showed real-time data from across the galaxy. In 1 year, the new council had saved 43 worlds from the dark matter anomaly. They had resolved 18 different trade disputes. They had shared breakthrough technologies with anyone who wanted them. The old council had taken 6 months just to schedule a meeting during their final years. Linda Brooks added crucial data to the presentation. She had analyzed the old council's last 1,000 years of operation. They had passed over 10 million regulations during that time. They had resolved fewer than 100 actual problems. They spent more time maintaining their system than using it to help anyone. But Vex was not finished. The Confederation leader asked the question that everyone was thinking. Without structure and rules, what prevented abuse of power? What stopped chaos from consuming everything? How could anyone trust a system with no formal controls? Jake answered by activating the Council's public transparency feed. Every decision they made was broadcast live. Every debate was recorded. Every allocation of resources was tracked and visible to anyone who wanted to look. The old system hid behind closed doors and secret procedures. The new system worked in the open, where everyone could see what was happening and challenge it if they disagreed. He explained that transparency was better than regulation. Rules could be twisted and procedures could be manipulated. But if everything was public, then abuse became obvious immediately. If someone made a bad decision, the whole galaxy would know within hours. That was better than any oversight committee. The vote came and it was not even close. 173 species supported humanity's continued leadership of the Council. Only 27 opposed. The Confederation had lost decisively. But Vex issued a final warning before leaving. Humanity was building a galaxy on foundations of sand. When this experiment failed, and it would fail, the consequences would be catastrophic. After the assembly ended, Jake stood alone in the now empty chamber. Emma Price found him there and asked if he was worried about Vex's warning. Jake said he was not worried about failure. Every experiment might fail. The old council had failed by refusing to try anything new. The new council would fail differently if it failed at all. They would fail by trying too much instead of too little. Ryan Bell joined them and pointed out that they had bigger problems than Vex. The dark matter anomaly was still growing. They had contained it in some areas, but it kept expanding in others. They needed a permanent solution, not just temporary shields. The galaxy had bought time, but time was running out. Jake smiled and said that was exactly the kind of problem they were good at solving. They had 200 species working together now. They had scientists and engineers from civilizations that had never collaborated before. They had people who had learned to think differently and try impossible things. If anyone could find a way to stop the anomaly permanently, it would be this group. The Cultural Revolution continued spreading across the galaxy. More species adopted flexible structures. More governments simplified their systems. More young beings questioned old assumptions. 2 years after finding the ancient station, Jake Lewis stood on an observation deck and watched the most diverse fleet ever assembled prepare for departure. The dark matter anomaly that had threatened the galaxy for centuries was about to face a coordinated response from over 300 species working together. The ships came in every shape and size imaginable, and they moved with a coordination that would have seemed impossible under the old council. The solution had come from an unexpected collaboration. A young Krell scientist named Voss had been working with human physicist Maya Ross on dimensional theory. They realized that the anomaly was not just consuming matter, but actually creating small dimensional rifts as it expanded. If they could seal those rifts, the anomaly would stop growing and eventually collapse on itself. The theory was brilliant, but testing it would be dangerous. Victor Hayes volunteered to lead the first test mission. He took a small ship with an experimental dimensional sealer into the edge of the anomaly. The whole galaxy watched through live feeds as he activated the device. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then space itself seemed to ripple and fold. The anomaly contracted by a measurable amount. It worked. Within days, teams were manufacturing sealers by the thousands. Every species contributed resources and manufacturing capacity. The Vryn provided rare materials. The Thex coordinated the logistics. The Zarathi offered their ships to deploy the devices. Humans designed the distribution system. It was collaboration on a scale that would have required years of planning under the old system. The new council did it in 3 weeks, but stopping the anomaly was only part of the story. The galaxy itself had transformed. The punk revolution that started on the council station had spread to almost every civilization. The changes were so fundamental that historians already called this the Reformation era. The economic systems had evolved dramatically. The old trade guilds still existed, but they no longer dominated. Thousands of independent merchants operated freely across the galaxy. Prices were more competitive. Innovation increased as small operators tried new approaches that the guilds would never have approved. The Vryn, who had once controlled most trade, now competed on equal terms with everyone else. Political systems changed even more dramatically. The hierarchy had restructured its entire government. Their administrative codes that once filled 10 million pages now filled 50,000. They had eliminated entire departments that existed only to oversee other departments. Citizens could actually understand how their government worked. Junior officials made decisions that once would have required approval from dozens of higher authorities. The Thex had evolved into what they called dynamic consensus. They maintained their hive mind connection, but individuals could now express disagreement and pursue independent ideas. The collective was stronger because it incorporated diverse thinking instead of enforcing uniformity. Elder queens who had opposed the changes now admitted that their species had never been more creative. Chris Wallace ran the day-to-day operations of the council station, and he had abolished most formal positions. People worked in fluid teams that formed around problems and dissolved when solutions emerged. Someone might spend a month working on agricultural systems and the next month designing new ships. There were no permanent departments or rigid hierarchies. It was organized chaos, and it worked better than traditional structures. The cultural fusion continued in unexpected ways. Music from dozens of species blended into new forms. Krell dimensional art influenced human architecture. Zarathi combat philosophy merged with Thex computational theory to create new approaches to problem solving. The galaxy was not just cooperating politically, but genuinely mixing culturally. Not everything went smoothly. The resource conflict in Sector 7 had escalated to the edge of war. The Denori and Kelvin were both mining operations that claimed the same asteroid field. Both sides had legitimate historical claims. Under the old system, lawyers would have argued for years. Greg Patterson had a different idea. He brought representatives from both sides to the disputed asteroids. He gave them construction equipment and said they had 1 week to build something together. If they could not cooperate, he would recommend the council seal the entire sector and prohibit mining by either side. Both groups were furious, but they had no choice. What happened next surprised everyone, including Greg. The Denori and Kelvin discovered they had complementary mining techniques. Denori were good at precision extraction. Kelvin excelled at large-scale processing. Working together, they could extract 3 times as much material as either could alone. By the end of the week, they had built a joint mining platform and submitted a proposal to operate it as a shared venture. Stories like that became common across the galaxy. Species that had barely spoken to each other were now collaborating on major projects. Old rivalries faded as beings realized cooperation was more profitable and more interesting than competition. The punk philosophy of trying things and fixing problems proved more effective than decades of formal diplomacy. The second anniversary of the Council's reawakening brought representatives from over 400 species to the station. What started as a planned ceremony turned into a massive celebration. Different species brought their own traditions and everyone shared freely. The party lasted 3 days and became famous across the galaxy. But during the celebration, Oliver Grant pulled Jake aside with urgent news. Oliver ran the science division and his team had made a disturbing discovery. They had been studying the dark matter anomaly carefully as they deployed the sealers. The more they learned, the more certain they became. The anomaly was not natural. It was artificial. Someone had created it as a weapon. Jake felt his stomach drop. He asked the question even though he already knew the answer would be bad. If someone built the anomaly, where were they now? Oliver showed him the data. His team had detected signals from beyond the galactic rim. Whoever created the weapon was still out there, and they were moving closer. Based on the speed and trajectory, they would arrive in the galaxy within 2 years. Jake looked out at the celebration happening around them. Hundreds of species mixing freely and working together. 1 year ago, most of them had never met. 2 years ago, the galaxy was fragmented and afraid. Now they had become something unprecedented. A true galactic community built on cooperation instead of regulation. He told Oliver to spread the word quietly. Let the other species know what was coming, but do not cause panic. They had 2 years to prepare, and a lot could happen in 2 years. The galaxy had learned to work together. Now they would learn to fight together. Ashley Cook was the station commander, and Jake brought her into the planning immediately. She started what she called open innovation sessions. Anyone with ideas about defending against unknown threats could contribute. Within days, they had proposals flooding in from thousands of beings. Military strategists offered conventional approaches. Young students suggested wild ideas that might actually work. Artists proposed psychological warfare tactics. Everyone wanted to help. The beauty of the new system was that they could try everything. Ideas that seemed impossible got tested immediately. If they worked, great. If they failed, they moved on to the next idea. There was no committee to approve research proposals, no lengthy review process, just constant experimentation and rapid iteration. Over the next 6 months, the galaxy prepared in ways that would have seemed chaotic under the old council, but proved remarkably effective. Shipyards across hundreds of worlds began building defensive platforms using collaborative designs. Species shared military technology freely, because everyone understood they faced a common threat. Training exercises brought together forces from dozens of civilizations who learned to coordinate in real time. The Zorathi, who had spent centuries fighting alone, became instructors. They taught rapid response tactics to species who had never seen combat. Their methods, combined with Thek's strategic computation and human improvisation, created a new form of coordinated warfare. It was not pretty or traditional, but it was effective. Jake spent long hours thinking about what they had built. The punk galaxy, as people were calling it, had no master plan, no comprehensive strategy, no thick binders full of regulations and procedures. What they had was better. They had hundreds of species who trusted each other. They had learned to act quickly and adapt constantly. They had discovered that treating problems as opportunities worked better than treating them as threats requiring endless meetings. The old civilizations had valued order and predictability. They had built complex systems to control every variable. When something unexpected happened, those systems collapsed because they could not adapt fast enough. The new galaxy valued flexibility and response. They built simple systems that could change rapidly. When something unexpected happened, they adjusted and kept moving. As the 2-year mark approached, the galaxy was ready. Not ready in the traditional sense of having perfect plans and ideal positioning, ready in the sense that they had built something unprecedented, a true galactic community that could face unknown threats together. They would adapt as the situation developed. They would try things and fix problems as they emerged. They would work together in ways no collection of species ever had before.